Ahead of the NATO summit, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stressed that Tehran should not be allowed to have a nuclear bomb. As Israel and Iran exchanged fresh strikes on Monday, he said his greatest fear was that Tehran had a nuclear weapon, which would give it a stranglehold on Israel and the rest of the world. However, he also dismissed suggestions that the war in the Middle East would deflect attention from the summit of the 32 NATO leaders. Rutte also noted that Iran was heavily involved in Russia's war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, shifting focus to the defense spending, which will be the key discussion at the NATO summit, Mark Rutte has said that new defense spending pledge will be announced at a summit in The Hague. Following this, publishing a letter from the alliance chief, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has insisted Madrid will not have to ramp up defense spending at the same rate as other NATO countries. NATO diplomats have disputed Madrid's view that it was granted an exception, but Sanchez backed up his claim by posting on X a letter from NATO chief Mark Rutte. The pledge is seen as key both to satisfying Trump, who has threatened not to protect allies spending too little, and helping NATO build up the forces it needs to deter Russia. Before we dive into the discussion, let's listen into what Mark Rutte has said.
The defense investment plan that allies will agree in The Hague introduces a new baseline, 5% of GDP to be invested in defense. This is a quantum leap that is ambitious, historic, and fundamental to securing our future. The new defense investment plan is the key deliverable for this summit and will be decisive when it comes to ensuring effective deterrence in defense.
Now we have guests joining us for this discussion. Ross Feingold, he's a political analyst joining us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for joining us today. Good to see you. Does NATO have a coherent policy on the Middle East, or is it reacting on case-by-case basis, mainly through U.S. leadership?
I think some of the NATO countries are very reluctant to endorse President Trump's decision to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, a few countries have said supportive things, most notably Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom. But I think other countries, that even the ones that opposed Iran having a nuclear weapon capability, they're really reluctant to give up diplomatic negotiations unless they feel that President Trump was too quick to engage in this. Generally speaking, they also don't want this to become a NATO issue. They want this to be a United States versus Iran issue and not a NATO versus Iran issue. So there are definitely some competing interests with regard to how the NATO members who are attending this summit this week, but how they approach their views with regard to President Trump's decision to attack Iran.
And now building on your own answer, could it drag NATO countries into a broader confrontation, the Israel-Iran-US conflict? And is there a real risk that the Middle East war could distract NATO from its core objective, containing Russia in Europe?
I think countries that want to be critical, they're going to have some very careful thoughts about doing that publicly, because they don't want to offend President Trump. President Trump made the decision to bomb Iran's nuclear weapons research and development facilities. And I think countries in NATO that even the ones that don't really like that idea, as I said, I think they're going to be very reluctant to publicly criticize Trump. They might do it behind closed doors. They might whisper it to media. But I think the prime ministers or presidents that are assembling in The Hague, they'll be reluctant to criticize President Trump publicly. With regard to the risk that it shifts attention from Ukraine, I think enough of the NATO members are really committed to Ukraine that that's going to be a counterweight to any possibility that focus might drift towards the Middle East. Countries like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, which are really the biggest military powers in Europe, I think they remain very united and very committed to assisting Ukraine. Although there are limits to the amount of support they could provide Ukraine in terms of ammunition or weapons or even cash, they're still very committed to doing that. And I think they're going to speak up at the meeting, even if they know President Trump is not open to it. But I think these countries, when it comes to Ukraine, they're going to continue to speak up.
You kind of suggested that NATO is not as divided as it seems now, but is Spain undermining NATO unity by claiming an exception to defense spending while publicly posting the NATO chief's letter to Spain?
Yeah, Spain is one country that's been very outspoken, or its prime minister specifically has been very outspoken against the 5% target spending for defense. He's laid out his reasons. He doesn't want it to detract from social spending, and he is a left of center prime minister, so social spending is very important to him. We'll see what happens when the leaders convene, but it looks like Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, he's very set on pushing this through. And I think the larger military powers, not just the United States, but countries like the UK, France, and Germany, and Italy, I think they're very much on board with raising NATO members' individual defense spending to 5% of GDP.
Thank you very much, Ross Feingold, for joining us today and sharing your expertise as a political analyst. Now we have a breaking news. The Chinese embassy in Qatar has reminded the Chinese citizens to strengthen safety precautions. Meanwhile, the British government issues warning to UK citizens in Qatar to shelter in place until further notice. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.